Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gapester here. This is the DPS guide for Normal and Heroic Blackhand, the final boss in Blackrock Foundry of course, and probably the last boss of the tier. Now Blackhand is a quite difficult encounter. It's a lot of fun though. It focuses on sort of three core mechanics that will be altered throughout the fight with a few extra things thrown in each phase to sort of get you used to dealing with those mechanics in ever-changing ways. So let's just get started. Now the first of these core mechanics that you'll deal with is Marked for Death, and in combination with that, Impaling Throw. Marked for Death will target two random ranged raid members, so ranged DPS are all valid, but melee are not. The idea here is after 5 seconds of being marked, the boss will use Impaling Throw, which will throw an axe or something toward those players at their current location. So you can see the marked players have a red skull above them. There's also an arrow that will point from the boss's location toward the targeted players. So you can clearly see the line trajectory where that mark throw is actually going to go out. The throw itself will deal pretty heavy damage to the first person it comes into contact with, and will also apply a 45-second dot, which does very heavy damage over time. Now, to handle this during the first and second phase, the general rule of thumb is to mitigate this throw effect and cancel it out by hiding behind some form of object that will block the throw itself. So in the first phase, you're hiding behind debris, which we'll talk about in a moment. In the second phase, you're hiding behind the sort of machines that will be kited around the room. In the third phase, there's nothing to hide behind, but we'll talk about that later. Overall, the goal here is to do your best to position yourself, if you're a ranged DPS and therefore a valid target, so that you can hide behind whatever object is available in that phase and be ready to mitigate that effect. If you accidentally get hit, you're too out of position, this will be a very big problem for the raid as a whole. The second core ability that you'll see throughout the fight are slag bombs and their subsequent slagged effect. So slag bombs in the first few phases will be spawned around the boss's location in a series of 3 rather. And after a few seconds they will activate. Anyone that touches a bomb will cause it to explode within a 10-yard radius, dealing heavy damage, but more importantly, also applying a 15-second debuff that increases damage taken by 100%. So, general rule of thumb is obviously melee will need to watch for these more closely than ranged, but both ranged and melee DPS need to be aware of the bomb locations and make sure you're not too close, either stepping in one yourself or in the second phase allowing them to explode nearby you. In the first phase here you can see the bombs are also going to be triggered by other mechanics, such as the Molten Slag that's emanated from the outside edge. The final core mechanic is Shattering Smash. This targets the current tank of the boss at the time. It will deal heavy damage to that location essentially, and split the damage among anyone that's inside the small radius on the tank's location. For the first phase, this will generally just be soloed by the tank. For the second phase, other players will need to step into the circle, but it's assigned based on who is handling that mechanic, which we'll talk about in a moment. And in the third phase, the majority of the raid will be inside it to help mitigate the damage. The basic idea is that the smash will knock the tank backwards away from the boss, but anyone else inside the smash will be knocked backwards relative to the tank, since the tank is the center location of that smash effect. So keeping that general rule in mind for the second and especially third phase will be important. So now that we know the core mechanics, let's go through each phase and talk about some of the extra stuff you'll deal with and how the core mechanics change. Beginning with phase 1, the new ability that you'll see is Molten Slag, as briefly mentioned. This is the slag that emanates from the outside of the room inward over time. Stepping in this does huge amounts of damage to you, and it will stack up over time, so the more time you spend in it, the more damage you'll take. As a DPS, you'll never need to be inside it, so make sure you just simply don't touch it. The critical thing to note here, for melee DPS in particular, is that when the slag touches existing bombs that are on the ground, those bombs will explode. So what this means is you need to watch your positioning closely so that you are not within 10 yards of a bomb that may be triggered from the slag that's coming in slowly. Otherwise, you as a DPS should not need to worry about that mechanic at all, because the raid and the tank in general will keep the boss away from the slag on the outside. Now, the other new mechanic that you'll see in the first phase is Demolition and the debris that these cause. So here you can see a number of small demolition circles, little brown ones. These generally do not need to be avoided. They just do minor damage to anyone, and the damage they deal is based on the distance you are from them. However, the larger, massive demolitions are indicated by the orange circles. Each set of demolition will spawn 3 of these, one after the other, and these do very heavy damage to the entire raid, but again, the damage is lessened the further from the point that they fell that you can stand. So your raid may have a different strategy for this, but the way that we handled it was to essentially move from one side of the room to the other, so that when the large or massive demolitions are falling, the range group is quite far away from them innately. This keeps the group together. We can ensure where these are falling at any given time and mitigate some of that damage. Generally speaking, this is going to be something that only ranged DPS need to think about. Melee will never generally be close enough, and since melee are not targets for the massive demolition, they don't have to worry about it. Now you'll notice that all the massive demolitions will drop down a little pile of debris on the ground at that location. This debris is what you will use as range players to hide behind for that Impaling Throw in the first phase. So here you can see Impaling Throw is coming out. There's debris in the center there, so both those players are hiding behind it, and the throw will hit the debris pile instead of the players. This is a critical thing to get used to as ranged DPS in this fight, because you're going to have to deal with this sort of mechanic constantly. In the first phase, you're hiding behind debris. In the second phase, you're hiding behind the machine, but that's still the same general idea. So you want to make sure you're always close enough to whichever debris pile you're using in this first phase that you can hide behind it. In the second demolition series, as you see here, if you're moving from one side to the other, you might need to really be ready to move behind the demolition pile as soon as possible, because one of them will be active, but probably only one by the time those throws go out. So you want to make sure you can get back to that first demolition pile that existed before it happens. Now, when the boss hits 71% or so, it's not quite exact, he will smash the floor out and you'll enter phase 2. From this position, you're going to deal with balconies and the soldiers that spawn up top on them, and the Siegemaker machines, as I mentioned before, which will spawn in one of the 4 doors on the outside of the room, whichever door is furthest from the boss's location at the time. Now, for dealing with the Iron Soldiers and the balconies, this is the job of a handful of DPS players, along with whichever tank is tanking the boss at the time, and probably one healer to keep everyone alive. The basic idea is DPS with higher area of effect burst damage, especially for non-targeted targets like balanced druids, death knights that spread diseases, rogues, stuff like that. They will have a better time with dealing with the balconies. The basic idea is that the tank will pull the boss slightly toward whichever balcony you're going to next, and then stay stationary when the smash is coming up next. When that smash hits, it will knock the tank backwards, of course, as mentioned, and it's up to the players that are assigned to go on the balcony to position themselves so that the smash will cause them to be knocked away from the tank up to the balcony that they want to go to. So you'll always start with the east balcony, that's the first set of soldiers that spawn, and then go to the west one, and then east, and then back and forth, and so on. Once you're up top on the balcony, kill the soldiers as quickly as you can. Don't be afraid to use dots if the dots are going to kill them off before the dot ends, then you can drop down after that or whatever. But the idea is to kill as many soldiers as you can, and then drop down before you take too much damage. While you are on the balcony, you will take damage over time that stacks up, so eventually you have to drop down before you get killed. In some instances, the healer that's supposed to go up will not be able to help you, or you may not even send a healer, so you need to watch your own health and just drop down when the time is right. Now, the other new mechanic for Phase 2, as mentioned, is the Siegemakers. And these are easily the most important mechanic of the fight, or excuse me, of the phase, rather. These, as mentioned, will spawn in the doorway furthest from the boss's location, so this is why the boss will generally be tanked slightly off-center. the Siegemaker will fixate on the nearest raid member to it once it spawns. Usually this is going to be handled by a ranged DPS with high movement, so often a hunter, which is what we used in our raids. And this hunter, for example, will be fixated for the duration of the Siegemaker's life, or while the hunter is alive, essentially. You want to kite the Siegemaker over top of all the bombs that are around the room. These bombs will remove the armor plating on the Siegemaker and allow DPS to actually attack it for full damage. Prior to the armor plating being removed, either by a bomb explosion or a Impaling Throw from the boss, the Siegemaker will only take 10% standard damage, so attacking it at that point is pointless. Instead, kite it over the mines or the bombs, and either when a first bomb or Impaling Throw hits, then as a ranged DPS you can attack the Siegemaker. Melee DPS should not generally attack the Siegemaker because it has a attack on its front, and it will walk over mines frequently, and when it does so, these bombs will explode in 10 yards around them, so you can't really afford to be too close. Beyond the actual kite mechanics and killing these, you want to, as a ranged DPS, make sure you're near enough to any existing or upcoming Siegemaker that you can hide behind it for the upcoming Mark for Death and therefore Impaling Throw. The general goal here is to throw 2 sets of Impaling Throws into the Siegemaker and have it die around that second set. If it survives too much longer, it will cause a pool of ever-expanding fire around the room that you just can't really deal with. So when a Siegemaker is active or when it's about to spawn, as ranged DPS, make sure you are close enough to where it's going to spawn. And again, it's generally going to be the furthest from where the boss is positioned, so that when you get targeted by Mark for Death, you can move quickly behind the Siegemaker to cause the throw to hit the Siegemaker instead of yourself. Now, I mentioned you want the Siegemaker to die around the second set of Impaling Throws on it. So this usually means that once you start attacking it, you want to stop when it reaches about 35% health. That will generally be the good number to leave it at, so that plus dot damage that's already ticking on it, it will die around the time the second set of throws actually hit it and deal pretty heavy damage to it. The final important note for Phase 2 is dealing with the every third set of Mark for Death and Impaling Throw. Because you are killing the Siegemaker around the second throw, you will not have a Siegemaker available for every third set. This means that players, instead of the Siegemaker, need to soak up this throw and subsequent dot damage. Each raid will have a slightly different way to deal with this, but the way that we found worked best was to have our tanks try to intercept these throws rather than allow them to hit the targeted ranged players. It's much easier to deal with the damage and heal the tanks from the dot damage that it causes rather than 2 randomly targeted people. So if that's the case for your raid, if you and the other targeted marked player are near enough to one another on this third set, you can just sidestep to make sure you are in a straight line with each other. This will allow the tank that's soaking to easily get in the arrow and soak both of them simultaneously. But if you are not near one another, you happen to be on opposite sides of the boss for some reason, don't try to get on the other side and screw something up. Just stay where you are, and the tank will either stand dead center and get both, or at least get one of them. And if you get hit by one, you'll get knocked back and you'll have a dot. Do your best to help your healers deal with the damage, but otherwise there's not much you can do. Now when the boss reaches 31% or so, the floor will drop out once more and you'll enter Phase 3. This is of course the final phase, and you want to immediately move to the edge, just some edge that your raid picks. It doesn't really matter which spot you go to. The basic idea here is that you're dealing with the core mechanics, but slightly modified versions, and there's sort of a soft and rage in that the raid will be taking ever-increasing damage over time from a ticking fire dot, as well as you'll eventually run out of space on the platform, that isn't sort of covered by slag and whatnot. So almost right away when you start the phase, 3 people will be targeted with slag bombs. So unlike the previous slag in the first and second phase, these are targeting random players. So one of them will always hit the current tank, but the other two will be on random raid members. It can be anybody. These people need to immediately run to the outside edge somewhere and try not to stand on top of other people so that when you explode after a few seconds, you will be the only person hit by the actual explosion. Just like before, this applies damage, but also the 15-second slag debuff where you take 100% more damage. So the best thing you can do is just come up with a system, and if you get targeted, make sure you run out to the side very quickly so that no one else is affected by this. The second critical change to the core mechanics for Marked for Death and then, of course, the Impaling Throw is that while this still only targets 2 random raid members, ranged players, this time it will pierce through all targets in line. So what this effectively means is if you get targeted for Marked for Death and the throw goes off and you're standing behind a bunch of other players in the raid, or in front of them for that matter, just anywhere in line with other people, everyone in that line will get hit by the throw, which is devastatingly bad. So the basic idea here is that the 2 Marked for Death players in each set need to move to the side. In our case, you can see our raid members are rotating to the right clockwise. So the Marked for Death players are always going to the right-hand side of the rest of the group. So if you're targeted by Marked for Death, you want to quickly sidestep to one side away from the rest of the raid, and then prepare to be knocked away. Just like in the rest of the fight, the Impaling Throw will knock players back. So if you get knocked back, the important thing here is not to get knocked off the platform. So you have to really watch your positioning relative to the rest of the raid, as well as the edge of the platform that you're going toward. And not to mention the other Marked for Death player who should be to your side one way or the other. If you have any form of personal immunity, you can use it when the throw hits you, which will prevent the initial hit and therefore the knockback effect. You'll still take the dot damage, but at least the knockback won't be a threat to you. Also, if you have any personal teleports or leap mechanics or anything like that, you can use those to stay on the platform after the knockback actually hits. And finally, the Shattering Smash is increased to a massive version on Phase 3. Effectively, this means that the majority of the raid needs to soak up the smash damage so that people don't die. It also means that because the majority of the raid will be inside the smash, everyone will be knocked away from the tank's position, as discussed before. So you need to really make sure that once the tank is set and the smash is about to happen, that you yourself are positioned in such a way that from the tank's position, you will be knocked backwards where you want to go, essentially to the center of the platform. The general rule of thumb is that if you were targeted by a slag bomb and just prior to the smash, you do not want to be inside the smash itself. Because you have the 100% damage taken debuff still, it's not really worth the extra damage on you as a player to help soak up a little bit more damage with the raid. So if you have a 20-man raid, for example, 3 people are going to be bombed. That means 17 other people should be in the massive smash to help mitigate the damage. So there you can see we're getting knocked back. I was actually slightly off to the left, unfortunately. So that means I just have further distance to run to get to our next position. So you want to just watch your direction relative to that tank again. And then overall, the last phase is quite simple, but it's just chaotic. There's a lot of stuff going on. The basic goal is, as I mentioned, to make use of the platform space you're given, and many different raids will have different strategies for this. We decided rotating clockwise was the most efficient use of our space. But the main thing is just to watch the timers, watch your debuffs, make sure you're ready to move out to the side for Marked for Death and the upcoming Impaling Throw. Make sure you're ready to move to the edges or to the side for the bomb. And otherwise, you're staying with the rest of the raid group ready for that smash to get knocked backwards. You just repeat this a few times, blow all your DPS cooldowns, your bloodlust, all that stuff during this phase so that you can kill the boss before you run out of room or before he kills off too many people. Anyway, that is the full DPS guide for Normal and Heroic Blackhand. As always, good luck, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.